that he was to some degree of excess a true-born Englishman, so as to have ever entertained an undue prejudice against both the country and the people of Scotland, must be allowed. But it was a prejudice of the head and not of the heart. He had no ill will to the Scotch, for if he had been conscious of that, he would never have thrown himself into the bosom of their country, and trusted to the protection of its remote inhabitants with a fearless confidence. His remark upon the nakedness of the country, from its being denuded of trees, was made after having travelled 200 miles along the eastern coast, where certainly trees are not to be found near the road. And he said it was a map of the road which he gave. This belief of the authenticity of the poems ascribed to Ossian, a Highland bard, was confirmed in the course of his journey by a very strict examination of the evidence offered from it. And although their authenticity was made too much a national point by the Scotch, there were many respectable persons in that country who did not concur in this, so that his judgment upon the question ought not to be decried, even by those who differ from it. As to myself, I can only say, upon a subject now become very uninteresting, that when the fragments of Highland poetry first came out, I was much pleased with their wild peculiarity, and was one of those who subscribed to enable their editor, Mr. Macpherson, then a young man, to make a search in the Highlands and Hebrides for a long poem in the Erse language, which was reported to be preserved somewhere in those regions. But when there came forth an epic poem in 6 books, with all the common circumstances of former compositions of that nature, and when, upon an attentive examination of it, there was found a perpetual recurrence of the same images which appear in the fragments, and when no ancient manuscript to authenticate the work was deposited in any public library, though there was insisted on a reasonable proof, who could forbear to doubt? Johnson's grateful acknowledgments of kindness received in the course of this tour completely refute the brutal reflections which had been thrown out against him, as if he had made an ungrateful return. In his delicacy in sparing in his books those who we find from his letters to Mrs. Thrale were just objects of censure is much to be admired. His candor and amiable disposition is conspicuous from his conduct when informed by Mr. MacLeod of Rasay that he had committed a mistake which gave the gentleman some uneasiness. He wrote him a courteous and kind letter and inserted in the newspaper an advertisement correcting the mistake. The observations of my friend Mr. Dempster in a letter written to me soon after he had read Dr. Johnson's book are so just and liberal, that they cannot be too often repeated. Quote, "There is nothing in this book, from beginning to end, that a Scotchman need to take amiss. What he says of the country is true, and his observations on the people are what must naturally occur to a sensible, observing, and reflecting inhabitant of a convenient metropolis, where a man of £30 a year may be better accommodated with all the little wants of life than Call or Sir Alan. I am charmed with his researches concerning the Erse language and the antiquity of their manuscripts. I am quite convinced, and I shall rank Ossian and his Fingals and Oscars among the nursery tales, not the true history of our country in all time to come. Upon the whole, the book cannot displease, for it has no pretensions. The author neither says he is a geographer, nor an antiquarian, nor very learned in the history of Scotland, nor a naturalist, nor a fossilist. The manner of the people and the face of the country are all he attempts to describe, or seems to have thought of. Much were it to be wished that they who have travelled into more remote, and of course more curious regions, had all possessed his good sense. Of the state of learning, his observations on Glasgow University show he has formed a very sound judgment. He understands our climate too, and he has accurately observed the changes, however slow and imperceptible to us, which Scotland has undergone in consequence of the blessings of liberty and internal peace." Unquote. Mr. Knox, another native of Scotland, who has since made the same tour and published an account of it, is equally liberal. And I quote, "I have read," says he, "his book again and again, travelled with him from Berwick to Glenelg, through countries with which I am well acquainted, sailed with him from Glenelg to Rassay, Skye, Rum, Call, Mull, and Ickhamkill, but have not been able to correct him in any manner of consequence. I have often admired the accuracy, the precision, and the justness of what he advances, respecting both the country and the people. The doctor has everywhere delivered his sentiments with freedom, and in many instances with a seeming regard for the benefit of the inhabitants and the ornament of the country. His remarks on the want of trees and hedges for shade, as well as for shelter to the cattle, are well founded, and merit thanks, not the illiberal censure of the natives. He also felt for the distress of the Highlanders, and explodes, with great propriety, the bad management of the grounds, and the neglect of timber in the Hebrides." Unquote. Having quoted Johnson's just compliments on the Rassay family, he says, quote, "On the other hand, I found this family equally lavish in their encomiums upon the doctor's conversation, and his subsequent civilities to a young gentleman of that country, who, upon waiting upon him at London, was well received, and experienced all the attention and regard that a warm friend could bestow. Mr. Macleod, having also been in London, waited upon the doctor, who provided a magnificent and expensive entertainment in honor of his old Hebridean acquaintance." Unquote. And talking of the military road by Fort Augustus, he says, quote, "By this road, though one of the most rugged in Great Britain, the celebrated Dr. Johnson passed from Inverness to the Hebrides Isles. His observations on the country and people are extremely correct, judicious, and instructive." Unquote. It says here to see page 103, but I'm not going to fall for that trick again. We're just going to skip over that. I'm not going to go look back and then not find what they're talking about. Mr. Tyler, the acute and able vindicator of Mary, Queen of Scots, is one of his letters to Mr. James Elphinstone, published in that gentleman's 40-year correspondence, says, "I read Dr. Johnson's tour with very great pleasure. Some few errors he has fallen into, but of no great importance, and those are lost in the numberless beauties of his work." Goes on, "If I had leisure I could perhaps point out the most exceptional places, but at present I am in the country and have not his book at hand. It is plain he meant to speak well of Scotland, and he had, in my apprehension, done to us great honour in the most capital article, the character of the inhabitants." End quote. His private letters to Mrs. Thrale, written during the course of his journey, this is Johnson, I'm assuming, which therefore may be supposed to convey his genuine feelings at the time, abound in such benignant sentiments towards the people who showed him civilities, that no man, whose temper is not very harsh and sour, can retain a doubt of the goodness of his heart. It is painful to recollect with what rancour he was assailed by numbers of shallow, irritable North Britons on account of his supposed injurious treatment of their country and countrymen in his journey. Had there been any just ground for such a charge, would the virtuous and candid Dempster have given his opinion of the book in the terms which I have quoted? Would the patriotic Knox have spoken of it as he has done? When Mr. Tyler, surely a Scot, if ever a Scot there were, have expressed himself thus? And let me add that, citizen of the world as I hold myself to be, I have the degree of predilection for my natale solum, my native soil. Nay, I have that just sense of the merit of an ancient nation, which has been ever renowned for its valour, which in former times maintained its independence against a powerful neighbour, and in modern times has been equally distinguished for its ingenuity and industry in civilized life, that I should have felt a generous indignation at any injustice done to it. Johnson treated Scotland no worse than he did even his best friends, whose characters he used to give as they appeared to him both in light and shade. Some people, who had not exercised their minds sufficiently, condemned him for censoring his friends. But Sir Joshua Reynolds, whose philosophical penetration and justness of thinking were not less known to those who lived with him than his genius in his art is admired by the world, explained his conduct thus, quote, "He was fond of discrimination, which he could not show without pointing out the bad as well as the good in every character. And as his friends were those whose character he knew best, they afforded him the best opportunity for showing the acuteness of his judgment." End quote. There's a footnote here I skipped over because I was on a little roll there when he's talking about Knox back there, patriotic Knox. "I observed with much regret, while the first edition of this book was passing through the press in August 1790, that this ingenious gentleman was dead." So, too bad. Anyway, back to the story at hand. Johnson expressed to his friends, Mr. Wyndham of Norfolk, his wonder at the extreme jealousy of the Scotch, and their resentment of having their country described by him as it really was, when to say that it was a country as good as England would have been a gross falsehood. "None of us," said he, "would be offended if a foreigner who had travelled here should say that vines and olives don't grow in England." And as to his prejudice against the Scotch, which I always ascribe to that nationality which he observed in them, he said it to the same gentleman, "When I find a Scotchman to whom an Englishman is as a Scotchman, that Scotchman shall be as an Englishman to me." Okay. His intimacy with many gentlemen of Scotland, and his employing so many natives of that country as his amanuensis, prove that his prejudice was not virulent, and I have deposited in the British Museum footnote again, not found there, amongst other pieces of his writing, the following note in answer to one from me, asking if he would meet me at dinner at the Mitre, though a friend of mine, a Scotchman, was to be there. Quote, "Mr. Johnson does not see why Mr. Boswell should suppose a Scotchman less acceptable than any other man. He will be at the Mitre." Unquote. My much valued friend, Dr. Bernard, now Bishop of Kildare, or actually Killaloe, having once expressed to him an apprehension that if he should visit Ireland, he might treat the people of that country more unfavourably than he had done the Scotch, he answered, with strong pointed double-edged wit, "Sir, you have no reason to be afraid of me. The Irish are not in a conspiracy to cheat the world by false representations of the merits of their countrymen. No, sir, the Irish are a fair people. They never speak well of one another." Oh, burn. He's a real Brit snob, this Johnson. "Johnson told me of an instance in Scottish nationality which made a very unfavourable impression upon his mind. A Scotchman of some consideration in London solicited him to recommend, by the weight of his learned authority, to be master of an English school, a person of whom he who recommended him confessed he knew no more, but that he was his countryman. Johnson was shocked at this unconscientious conduct. All the miserable cavillings against his journey in newspapers, magazines, and other fugitive publications, I can speak from certain knowledge, only furnished him with sport. At last there came out a scurrilous volume, larger than Johnson's own, filled with a malignant abuse under a name, real or fictitious, of some low man. Footnote here from a later editor tells us this is Reverend Donald McNichol. In an obscure corner of Scotland, though supposed to be the work of another Scotchman, footnote here says James Macpherson, who had found means to make himself well known both in Scotland and England. The effect which it had upon Johnson was to produce this pleasing observation to Mr. Seward, to whom he lent the book. Quote, "This fellow must be a blockhead. They don't know how to go about their abuse. Who will read a 5-shilling book against me? No, sir, if they have wit, they should have kept pelting me with pamphlets." Unquote. Mr. Boswell to Dr. Johnson, Edinburgh, February 18, 1775. "You would have been very well pleased if you had dined with me today. I had for my guests Macquarie, young Maclean of Cole, the successor of her friend, a very amiable man, though not marked with such active qualities as his brother, Mr. Maclean of Torsick and Mull, a gentleman of Sir Alan's family, and two of the clan Grant, so that the Highland and the Hebridean genius reigned. We had a great deal of conversation about you, and drank your health in a bumper. The toast was not proposed by me, which is a circumstance to be remarked, for I am now so connected with you that anything that I can say or do to your honour has not the value of an additional compliment. It is only giving you a guinea out of the treasure of admiration which already belongs to you, and which is no hidden treasure, for I suppose my admiration of you is coexistent with the knowledge of my character. I find that the Highlanders and Hebrideans in general are much fonder of your journey than the Low Country or Hither Scots. One of the Grants said today that he was sure you were a man of a good heart and a candid man, and seemed to hope he should be able to convince you of the antiquity of a good proportion of the poems of Ossian. After all that had passed, I think the matter is capable of being proved to be to a certain degree. I am told that Macpherson got one old Erse manuscript from Clan Ranald, for the restitution of which he executed a formal obligation. And it is affirmed that the Gaelic, called an Erse, or call it Irish, has been written in the Highlands and Hebrides for many centuries. It is reasonable to suppose that such of the inhabitants as acquired any learning possess the art of writing as well as their Irish neighbours and Celtic cousins. And the question is, can sufficient evidence be shown of this? Those who are skilled in ancient writings can determine the age of manuscripts, or at least can ascertain the century in which they were written. And if men of veracity who are so skilled shall tell us that the manuscripts in this possession of families in the Highlands and Isles are the works of a remote age, I think we should be convinced by their testimony. There is now come to the city Ranald MacDonald, from the Isle of Egg, who has several manuscripts of Erse poetry, which he wishes to publish by subscription. I have engaged to take 3 copies of the book, the price of which is to be 6 shillings, as I would subscribe for all the Erse that can be printed, be it old or new, that the language may be preserved. This man says that some of his manuscripts are ancient. And to be sure, one of them, which was shown to me, does appear to have the duskiness of antiquity. ... The inquiry is not yet quite hopeless, and I should hope that the exact truth may be discovered and proper means be used. I am, etc., James Boswell. To James Boswell, Esquire. Dear Sir, I am sorry that I could get no books for my friend in Scotland. Mr. Stratham has at last promised to send 24 to you. If they come, put the names of my friends into them. You may cut them out from a list in his handwriting, it says in the footnote, and paste them with a little starch in the book. I don't know what that means. That's some old book technology. You then are going wild about Ossian. Why do you think any part can be proved? The dusky manuscript of Egg is probably not 50 years old. If it be 100, it proves nothing. The tale of Clan Ranald has no proof. Has Clan Ranald told it? Can he prove it? There are, I believe, no Erse manuscripts. None of the old families had a single letter in Erse that we heard of. You say it is likely that they could write. The learned, if any learned there were, could. But knowing by that learning some written language, if that language they wrote, as letters have never been applied to their own. Let me read that again. The learned, if any learned there were, could. But knowing by that learning some written language, in that language they wrote, as letters have never been applied to their own. That doesn't sound right to me. The learned, if any learned there were, could. But knowing by that learning some written language, in that language they wrote, as letters had never been applied to their own. I can't understand that right now. I'd have to read this whole paragraph again. So I'm going to spare you that. If there are manuscripts, let them be shown, with some proof that they are not forged for the occasion. You say many can remember parts of Ossian. I believe all those parts are versions of the English. At least there is no proof of their antiquity. Macpherson is said to have made some translation himself, and having taught a boy to write it, ordered him to say that he had learned it by his grandmother. The boy, when he grew up, told the story. This Miss Williams heard at Mr. Strahan's table. Do not be credulous. You know how little a Highlander can be trusted. Macpherson is, so far as I know, very quiet. Is not that proof enough? Everything is against him. No visible manuscript, no inscription in the language, no correspondence among friends, no transactions of business, of which a single scrap remains in the ancient families. Macpherson's pretense is that the character was Saxon. If he had not talked unskillfully of manuscripts, he might have fought with oral tradition much longer. As to Mr. Grant's information, I suppose he knows much less on the matter than ourselves. In the meantime, the booksellers say that the sale, this is about his journey of the Western Isles of Scotland, is sufficiently quick. They printed 4,000. Correct your copy wherever it is wrong and bring it up. Your friends will all be glad to see you. I think of going myself into the country about May. I am sorry that I have not managed to send the books sooner. I have left 4 for you, and do not restrict you absolutely to follow my directions in the distribution. You must use your own discretion. Make my compliments to Mrs. Boswell. I suppose she is now just beginning to forget me. I am, dear sir, your humble servant, February 25th, 1775, Sam Johnson. Well, I guess now I'm going to have to look up this whole Ossian conspiracy and see what the end result was. Till next time, bye from Boswell.